Hi, everyone joining. We're going to get started in just a minute. Just some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. And as I said, I think chat works now. And we will be leaving ample time for questions at the end. So you can use the Q&A feature to ask any questions as we move through our speakers. Okay, I will review our agenda since it's pretty packed. We'll go and get started. We are going to start off with some introductions from CRC staff, and then we'll move through our panelists. A lot of great speakers and experts in the room today. We'll first turn over to April Merleaux from Rainforest Action Network to talk about their Banking on Climate Chaos report. We'll then go to Alex Martin from AFR to talk about some financial regulation efforts related to climate. Then we'll go to Sylvia Chi from Just Solutions Collective to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and how local groups can tap into those funds, and just to be aware of what's available, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Then we'll go to Wendy Miranda from Esperanza Community Housing Corporation to talk about some local climate advocacy efforts and wins in the city of Los Angeles. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to leave a lot of time for Q&A from the audience and amongst the panelists. So yeah, we'll get started with some opening remarks from the CEO of California Reinvestment Coalition, Paulina Gonzalez-Brito. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks all of you for joining us today for this important conversation and taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. The California Reinvestment Coalition, we did our strategic plan in 2019, and as a part of that process, we held several convenings across the state of California to talk to our members. And our members are mostly, while they all work in communities of color and low-income communities, we have members who are CDFIs, affordable housing developers, tenant organizations, housing and financial counselors, a whole array of community-based organizations that are our members. And we met with them around our strategic planning process. And I'll never forget this because it was at the time that the state was literally on fire. There were so many fires across the state. Cities were, and not just cities, but all parts of the state were choking on smoke. And as we met with our members, one of the biggest questions we had for them was, what is it that they think are our top priorities for the next 5 years as part of our strategic plan? And climate was top of mind for everybody. And what was discussed was that climate change and the impacts of climate change are a racial and economic justice issue, and that CRC should be at the center of that fight and doing what we can to advance just climate solutions, just transitions, and to mitigate, to reduce the harm and eliminate the harm to hardest hit communities. So I want to thank the Sunrise Project for helping us to do just that, to scale up our work in this area, and for their continued support and partnership. The strategy that came out of our strategic plan was to reduce impacts of climate change on the hardest hit communities. And so that's what we're focused on. For the past year, we've been increasing our work and advocacy around building climate resiliency in California communities of color and low-income communities, which are disproportionately impacted by environmental racism and climate change, least responsible for it, and who are often least prepared to respond to it. Next slide. So here's some maps. They may be a little hard to see, but basically you've all seen redlining maps: green, blue, yellow, red. Red being the areas that were designated as high risk, green being the most desirable neighborhoods for banks to lend and invest in. And there's a correlation between those redlining maps and life expectancy. You can see here the differences in life expectancy, about 10 to 15 years between the red and the green. Historic trends of systemic discrimination and denial of access to credit and wealth building assets are now compounding with climate change. These maps from NCRC illustrate that in some of California's largest metropolitan areas, so this is Los Angeles and Oakland, formerly redline neighborhoods have as much as a 15-year lower life expectancy than wider, more affluent neighborhoods previously graded as desirable or best. It's important that banks divest from the oil and gas sector and build climate resiliency in these communities. Next slide. So historically, redline neighborhoods, those maps that we showed you, those red areas and the yellow areas, have twice the number of gas wells and oil wells and have higher morbidity rates for illnesses like asthma, eczema, and cancer. Studies have found that banks are less likely to lend in areas most impacted by climate change, leaving already disinvested communities and families even further behind. And this is known as blue lining. In 2020, the top 60 banks' fossil fuel financing reached $669 billion in 2022 alone. Their dollars directly contribute to the climate crisis, which disproportionately affects communities of color and low-income communities. Next slide. And just this is you know, what drives our work. Banks have a moral and regulatory obligation via CRA to end its support for environmental racism and climate change, and instead reinvest into historically disinvested communities to help them build resiliency. And that's at the core of our work. We're developing our approach to this issue, and our recommendations for banks are forthcoming. To say a bit more about that, I will turn it over to Kevin Stein.
Great. Thanks, Paulina. And thanks everyone for joining. We appreciate you being here with us. As Paulina mentioned, I just want to quickly give a sense of some of the things that we are working on as we're kind of scaling up our capacity to work on these issues. First, I guess, is around capacity. So we're spending a fair amount of time getting up to speed on the issues and learning as much as we can, as quickly as we can. And in that regard, just do really want to thank Sunrise Project and our panelists, the panel speakers, who have been so generous with their time and with their knowledge. It's really helped us be in a better position to engage. So we thank you for that. We've started to engage on some policy matters relating to the intersection of banking and climate. And I'm just going to mention a few. There's actually quite a bit that's going on. For those who are interested, it's and maybe many know, it's a good time to be thinking about these issues because there's a lot of attention to these intersections. Paulina mentioned the Community Reinvestment Act. CRC members well know that the banking regulators have been working on revising, updating the CRA rules for quite some time. Amongst our comments, one of the things that we tried to highlight was the need to better incorporate climate into the Community Reinvestment Act, which, you know, is currently not the case. And, you know, how do we do that? We propose that specifically banks get credit under the CRA for investing in the climate resiliency of neighborhoods on the one hand, and on the other, that there actually be downgrades for banks engaging in fossil fuel finance and other harms to climate. Those rules, as people know, we're waiting for the final rule. We don't know exactly when it will come out, but we will be tracking that and interested to see how they deal with the climate issue. We're also really interested in the opportunity to work with the regulators on reform of the bank merger process. So the regulators have kind of begun thinking about this, and the merger process is meant to consider public benefit and systemic risk and convenience and needs. And we feel that it doesn't always do such a great job of that. In our comments to date, we're saying, amongst other things, that process really needs to elevate concerns relating to climate and also to community input and participation. And we think there'll be further opportunities to comment on that going forward. There's also a lot of consideration from the regulators on how they should view the climate-related financial risk to banks. And I think I'm going to leave this one for Alex. Alex may talk about it, but CRC members should know this is something we may come back to you all on in the coming months. And then importantly, the last one I wanted to flag here was around state CRA. So people may know that we are interested in bringing the Community Reinvestment Act to California. We love the federal CRA. There are certain weaknesses to it. One of those being that it doesn't, currently, and we'll see what happens in the final rule, account for climate. And so we are going to be coming back to CRC members in the shorter term with our thoughts and asking for engagement around what should state CRA look like, and climate considerations and how financial institutions deal with that issue, and the impact on communities will certainly be a part of it. And then the other thing that we do that people know, our members certainly know, is we engage on bank mergers where we have concerns. The last few mergers, we have been raising concerns about climate, in particular, really citing the climate chaos report that April is going to talk about, which we find so compelling and helpful, that really demonstrates how much the largest institutions in particular are financing fossil fuels and climate harm. In the last couple of big mergers, this is US Bank buying Union Bank, and Bank of the BMO Harris buying Bank of the West. So I think that first slide is a little off as I look at it. And who's responsible for that? I am. So apologies. US Bank bought Union Bank, as people know. We were pleased to be able to negotiate community benefits agreements with the two banks during those mergers. The CBAs, were large. We're mainly focused on our traditional community development and affordable housing, mortgage, small business issues. But having raised concerns about climate, there is some language in there relating to climate. So you'll see in those commitments some language around acknowledging the problem, in climate resiliency being something that could be funded through contributions or investments, some language around disclosures, and a willingness to work with CRC and other community groups to kind of enhance those. So we really, we hope that's kind of a platform that we can build off of as we strengthen our advocacy around climate in the merger context. And then the last point I wanted to raise is that we're currently opposing one bank merger. This is the merger, the proposed merger of Luther Burbank Savings, based in California, with Washington Federal Bank. In the I see our opposition letter has been put in the chat. So we noted some of our traditional concerns. There were mortgage lending disparities, concerns about lending to problematic landlords that are displacing tenants, concerns about connection to attacks on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But through our research, we also discovered that Washington Federal finances oil and gas companies. And so we raised that as a concern and we submitted our letter, and there were 43 groups that joined us in opposing the merger. And so we thank those of you who joined us. It's really important and helpful, to the point where the banks, to their credit, did reach out to us and tried to engage us and see if they could address some of our concerns. We had identified, and if you look to the right of this slide, this is kind of like where we are now. These are the things that we have been focusing on in our conversations, in our thinking about what banks should be doing. And I'll just quickly list them as I kind of end my piece here. So, and all of where we are is really informed a lot by our friends, many of whom who are going to be speaking after me. So we appreciate all the efforts that have really helped us in identifying these priorities. So we're saying financial institutions should agree not to fund new extraction projects. They should increase disclosures. They should develop transition plans that show how they're going to move away from climate harm and fossil fuel finance. They should make specific commitments to fund climate resiliency in neighborhoods of color in California. Paulina mentioned blue lining. There should be some due diligence procedures that are put in place so that banks will not further discriminate against communities because they determine that they're risky, because they're subject to floods and fires as a result of climate change over which they had no responsibility. And we're also trying to support calls for respecting of the rights of Indigenous peoples. If people are interested in that merger, please let me know. If you're interested in any of this, let me know. The main message I leave you with is the main message I should have started with is, as we're refining our approach and trying to build our advocacy, we really want CRC members to be with us and help us and inform our efforts. So if people, I think we're developing a climate cohort committee, and at some point someone will, anyone can, there's my email address, people can contact me, and I think there'll be a link for CRC members who are interested to join us in helping us think it all through. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jamie, who is going to talk about some exciting research she conducted that really kind of came out of the Washington Federal Research and Merger. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I sent the Google form sign up about the climate cohort. So if you want to stay up to date, you can sign up there. I am, as Kevin mentioned, going to just briefly preview some research we've been working on related to PPP funding of oil and gas companies. Many of you are well versed in the Paycheck Protection Program, which was intended to keep small businesses afloat and support their employees. But there were a lot of early concerns of bad design and implementation of the program, that it was potentially reinforcing redlining and exclusionary bank practices by favoring existing bank customers. And how does this relate to fossil fuel financing from banks, and why use this data source compared to some of the sort of capital markets funding and research that April really extensively does. The PPP data is readily available and pretty easy to parse through, and the implication that federal funds that banks may be receiving profit of federal funds for their funding of oil and gas companies is something particularly problematic, especially when the program was designed to support small businesses. Just going briefly over key findings, as you can imagine, some of the top banks like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and Bank of America were some of the top PPP lenders to oil and gas companies, both nationally and California. Across the country, there was a total of nearly $6 billion going to oil and gas companies. However, of note, some smaller and regional banks like Frost, Zions, and Prosperity did contribute a substantial amount of lending to oil and gas companies. Particularly, Tri-Counties dominated the lending to operations in California when accounting for both loan count and dollar volume. In the report, this is just a preview of some of the analysis here. So we include dollar volume, total dollar volume, as well as number of loans. So as you can see, some smaller banks did play a big role, like Zions, that although they made half the number of loans that Wells Fargo made, which made the largest amount of loans to oil and gas companies across the country, Zions still made nearly $125 million more in dollar volume to oil and gas companies in PPP loans. We also estimate revenue derived from the processing fees. So the SBA created sort of a tiered processing fee that they paid out to lenders of the program. And again, this is sort of our concern that banks are not only giving money that was supposed to be given out to small businesses, instead to larger oil and gas companies. And not only are they contributing to climate change, but they're also potentially reaping financial benefits of it. So again, this is sort of our concern and illustrates the need for more corporate accountability of this. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of financing going on, and someone that does really expert research in this space is April Merleaux from Rainforest Action Network. She is a research manager with the Climate and Energy team, where she guides strategic research for the organization's campaigns to stop fossil fuel expansion and financing. One of the ways is through this annual report. Before joining RAND, she taught environmental studies and has a history at the college level, holds a PhD from Yale, and master's from Tufts, and a BA from Reed College. Outside of work, campaigns on climate change, healthcare, and racial justice, and works very closely with faith communities. April actually helped us a lot with the upcoming PPP report and has helped us a lot just throughout this work as we've been trying to expand. So really glad that she's able to be here today. So I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you for the invitation. It's been really great to watch this research that has been evolving and to see the directions that is going to go. So I'm going to give folks a quick overview of the Banking on Climate Chaos report from 2023, which we just launched in early April. Can I have the next slide? So this report is one that we've produced in some form or another for the last 14 years. It began at a much smaller scale, reporting on scoring banks for their financing of really problematic sectors like mountaintop removal coal mining, and over the years has grown. And since 2019, we have looked at all fossil fuels, financing for those from private banks, and then also look at some spotlight sectors. So our report covers the 60 largest banks globally. We look at lending and underwriting, so the issuances of bonds and stocks, as well as the provision of loans. This year we had more than 600 endorsing organizations from 75 countries, and we have online interactive data and policy scores, which I'll give you a snapshot of in a minute. Next slide. So before I dig into some of our findings, I want to just highlight some of the purposes that this research goes to. So super excited to hear about the fact that Kevin and Jamie used some of our research in their letters in opposition to some of these bank mergers. That's exactly what we hope this data will be useful for. So another example of that is some of our partners or colleagues in France have been suing the bank BNP Paribas over their energy loans using data from Banking on Climate Chaos. So it has wide use in the media, among shareholders, and as a resource for campaigners. Next slide. So our biggest takeaway this year from this year's report is that in the 7 years since the Paris Agreement went into effect, which was in 2016, the world's 60 largest banks poured $5.5 trillion into the fossil fuel industry. You'll see here the chart, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the trends that we saw in the data. Next slide. But before I do that, I want to talk about a couple of other key findings. So one really big thing for us this year was that for the first time since we've been looking at all fossil fuels, the Royal Bank of Canada was the #1 worst financier of fossil fuels. So they edged out JP Morgan Chase. No worries, JP Morgan Chase still is overall the worst since the Paris Agreement went into effect. So they have provided $434 billion of financing to fossil fuels since 2016. RBC provided $41 billion in 2022, making for a total of $253 billion since 2016. And this actually looks like a trend. So we saw as a whole the Canadian banks, the major Canadian banks, all increase their financing, where other banks actually in some cases decrease their financing. But Canadian banks are taking up a greater share of our overall data set. Next slide. I want to also name that this report is not just about the finance numbers that we, part of our coalition. This is a coalition of 7 organizations that work together, of which the Indigenous Environmental Network is a crucial partner. And we frame all of this work in terms of Indigenous people sovereignty and really the reality that keeping fossil fuels in the ground is the way to protect human rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and to protect against climate chaos. That keeping fossil fuels in the ground rather than the kinds of false solutions that we see banks pursuing is the way to a livable future. Next slide. So this slide reiterates the dirty dozen, the worst fossil fuel financiers since 2016. You'll see that the majority of these institutions are North American. We do see Canadian banks rising in the rankings, and Japanese banks, in particular, the two Japanese mega banks, Mizuho and MUFG, are rising in the rankings. And then a couple, BNP Paribas, who I mentioned a minute ago, and Barclays Bank, two European banks. Next slide. In addition to all fossil fuels, we look at financing for a selection of companies representing these particular sectors: Arctic oil and gas, offshore, fracked oil and gas, tar sands, liquefied natural gas, coal mining, coal power, and new this year it was Amazon oil and gas. We also look at companies expanding fossil fuels. So look at the top 100 companies expanding upstream oil and gas as well as coal. Slide. So I want to talk a little bit more about these trends for a minute. So the way that I've been describing this is that fossil fuel financing decreased in 2020, largely related to the pandemic. It rebounded in 2021 and then has leveled out a little bit in 2022. So even though it looks like there might be a dip in the financing, I'm actually not super hopeful that this is the beginning of a long-term trend. And I want to explain a couple of the reasons why I think that's the case. Next slide. So the first reason that I don't think this is the beginning of a long-term trend is because last year was a really unusual year in the energy markets. So fossil fuel companies made record profits. And because they made these record profits growing out of the chaos in the energy market from the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, they really were able, in many cases, to sit out of capital markets. They had a ton of cash on hand. And so it just made more sense for a number of companies to use their cash rather than borrowing, particularly given that interest rates were rising, bond markets were sort of chaotic otherwise. Next slide. So the example that I like to use for this is Occidental Petroleum Company. So between 21 and 22, Occidental had a 721% increase in profits, right? A 721% increase in profits between 21 and 22. Occidental had borrowed on average about $11 billion per year since 2016 from the banks in the scope of our report. And how much did they borrow in 2022? Nothing, right? So those profits translated directly into them sitting out of the capital markets. And we saw this with a number of oil majors, so big players that typically have borrowed quite a bit. So that accounts for some of that drop in financing, and that's not something that we're anticipating is going to stay, right? So energy markets are already leveling out, prices are going down. We're not anticipating that those profits are going to stick around, and so it's very likely that fossil fuel companies are going to come back and start borrowing again. Next slide. The other reason has to do with the cycles of development within the oil and gas industry itself. So this chart shows estimates from the oil and gas industry of the amount of oil and gas that they anticipate bringing into development or like reaching final investment decision per year. And so they estimate that 2022 is actually not quite the lowest, but the next to lowest amount of oil coming into development since 2015, but that will increase. They're anticipating that that's going to increase in 2023 and then increase even more, so that 2024 is actually the most significant year for new reserves coming into development. So we anticipate that it's very likely that fossil fuel financing will follow a similar trajectory, because we know that the financing comes about when a project reaches an investment decision like this. Next slide. In addition to fossil fuel finance, our report evaluates banks' policies, so the policies they have around climate, and we look at two kinds of policies. One are exclusion policies, where they make a commitment not to finance a particular sector, and the other are net zero targets, where they have committed to reducing the emissions across their portfolio over a particular period of time. And overall, we find that their policies of the 60 banks are too weak and have too many loopholes. Next slide. So one kind of loophole that I want to talk about really quickly and not give a lot of detail about is this loophole that has to do with project finance versus finance for general corporate purposes. So typically we find that fossil fuel companies they apply for financing for general corporate purposes. Unfortunately, most bank policies where they'll say, for example, we aren't going to finance fossil fuel exploration and development in the Arctic, those only apply when the company has applied for project finance, which is a very particular form of structuring a deal. So it enables a bank that has an Arctic policy to go ahead and finance a ConocoPhillips that's developing the Willow project in the Arctic, because ConocoPhillips applied for financing for general corporate purposes rather than specific project finance. So we see a lot of loopholes like that that allow banks to continue financing fossil fuels as usual. Next slide. Likewise, we find a lot of weaknesses in the net zero commitments that banks have made over the last 2 years. One example of that is just the fact that of the 49 of our banks that have made net zero commitments, those 49 banks financed $122 billion to the top 100 companies expanding fossil fuels in 2022. So that's the majority of the financing that went to those 100 companies came from banks that have made net zero commitments. So it really calls into question the sincerity of those commitments. Next slide. We can skip this chart in the interest of time. So I want to just wrap up by pointing out that our data is available on our website, bankingandclimatechaos.org. The data is interactive. You can explore it by year, by sector, by bank or client. You can also download the data as spreadsheets, so you can do different kinds of things with it for your own particular purposes. Next slide. And the bank policy is also, you can also explore the bank policies on the website, and the net zero commitments are also available to explore on that. Next slide. And finally, we have an interactive map of frontline stories from the front lines of folks who are fighting the build out of fossil fuels directly. And that includes a very recently launched story about the build out of LNG import facilities in the Philippines in a protected marine area. Next slide. Just quickly, we'll say that the demands in our report are at a very high level, and they should resonate with some of the demands that Kevin laid out a little bit ago. So the first one is to prohibit all finance for fossil fuel expansion immediately, to adopt absolute financed emissions reduction targets, to demand robust transition plans from their existing fossil fuel clients, to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples and human rights, and to scale up financing for a just transition. And with that, I am going to pass things back to Jamie.
Thank you so much, April. A lot of really interesting and disheartening information present, but really important work. Some more important work to share from Alex Martin, who is Senior Policy Analyst for Climate and Finance at Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund. He manages the organization's growing engagement and policy portfolio at the intersection of financial regulation, climate change mitigation. And Alex has served as a legislative fellow on the climate team for Senator Schatz in Hawaii, and as informal committee staff for the Senate Democrats Special Committee on the Climate Crisis. He's focused on carbon storage tax incentives, climate-related systemic financial risk, economy-wide decarbonization, and environmental justice. Before coming to AFR, he worked at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine on projects related to climate energy, low carbon vehicles, deep decarbonization pathways, and has focused his research on atmospheric chemistry, materials, science, and optics. this space, the intersection of FinReg and climate crisis, is really important for our work, and this work has been really helpful for us internally. So I'm excited to hear his presentation. Hopefully you find it just as helpful as we have. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, thanks very much to Jamie for that introduction, and to CRC for hosting this important discussion, and to the audience members for joining. I'm really excited to be here. We'll switch gears a little bit and talk climate FinReg, climate financial regulation. We just heard from April about the extensive amount of fossil fuel finance that banks are still extending today. This is despite the pleas from scientific bodies, the UN, and others about the dire climate situation we find ourselves in, with impacts obviously occurring, every year as we can watch them happen in real time. This is despite their bank's lofty net zero by 2050 commitments, which, if credible, would require steep reductions in financed emissions starting immediately. And this is despite the findings of IEA, the International Energy Agency, and others, that most of these new fossil fuels will need to become stranded assets. In other words, abandoned and not returning any profit if the world is to succeed and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is, a baseline position for us to have a livable communities and general thriving. So there are extensive corporate campaign and investor efforts to get fossil fuel firms and banks to stop the madness and start phasing down or phasing out fossil fuels in line with science-based targets. But besides being bad for the planet and communities, continued finance for fossil fuel expansion is incredibly risky. And that means financial regulators have a responsibility to pay attention to it, that it's risky. It makes climate change worse, making physical impacts of climate change worse for communities and the economy. And it's a bad bet for banks and investors. And when banks fail, regular people are harmed as well. You can think of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, when we had a big meltdown and it rebounded upon the full economy and left a lot of people high and dry. So the good news is, partially in response to the 2008 crisis, but also because of rules that were already in place, we do have government tools available to cut down on bank risk-taking through the field of financial regulation, through which the government supervises. It makes rules for banks and other financial firms. And believe it or not, banks actually are not allowed to lie to their customers and investors, despite the fact that it seems to happen with some regularity. Most of the banks that April mentioned talk about having a net zero by 2050 commitment. And there's very particular hooks and ways that the financial regulators can scrutinize those statements, especially when there's discrepancies between how they talk about their commitments in fundraising, what they put in SEC filings, their stock market filings, what they put in their bank regulatory filings. That all has to seem consistent, and they're just kind of getting a handle on that right now. So in the past few years, as the climate crisis has gotten much worse, the government has started to consider managing banks' climate-related risk-taking, and that's what we're now calling climate financial regulation. I put up here the 3 types of climate financial risk that we typically talk about. Physical risk includes losses and damages that come from storms, fires, floods, heat waves, and decreased productivity, which can harm finances in many ways. Transition risks are losses that come from changes to consumer preferences, technologies like clean energy, or from regulation that causes repricing of assets or devaluations. For example, if the Inflation Reduction Act, this big bill that recently passed, actually leads to lower demand for fossil fuels, which the modelers believe that it will, this means that fossil fuel assets will be worth less, and certain banks will face defaults on loans backed by these assets. And so it's not only bad for communities and the planet, it's risky. And that's a hook that regulators can use to get in and make changes. The last risk isn't always part of the equation, but we would like to push for a holistic view that considers how consumers and communities fare. And so community risk is the risk of, for example, blue lining practices that Paulina mentioned at the outset, pollution to communities, and also pushback from communities that can cause financial impairment to different projects. Those things are really important. And we're working on right now some case studies outlining when community pushback is actually causing financial risk for companies. And then there's a requirement that those risks be disclosed to the public. So we can go to the next slide. So a few of the things that climate financial regulation could do to limit those risks include things like making the cost of carbon emissions better reflected in market prices and risk management, embedding the societal cost into the upfront financial decision-making. Communities can, through financial regulation, get better access to climate mitigation and resilience resources. So Kevin mentioned the Community Reinvestment Act. We're hoping that will explicitly include climate investment for vulnerable communities. There's financial stability concerns. This deals with just the general stability of different financial institutions. Harkening back to the global financial crisis, it's bad when banks fail. And so the regulators have the ability to make them manage the amount of climate risk in their portfolios to avoid new instabilities. And then finally, investors should have all the climate risk information they need to make smart choices and properly allocate capital. And so a good information environment where the public and regular folks have the same information that JP Morgan has, that can help properly price in and smooth out the transition. Next slide. There are tons of financial regulators in the US. It's absurd that we have so many. We should probably consolidate, but I've listed 3 really important ones here that have extremely important roles in climate FinReg. And I'll talk about a couple ways that folks can plug into efforts at each of these. So we have the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is with the mandate to protect investors and maintain fair and efficient markets. SEC regulates the stock market, and it's the one that's going to get us enhanced disclosure of these risks, including risks from community and localized impacts. You have the Federal Reserve, which is meant to ensure financial stability, full employment, stable prices. That includes inflation. And the Fed supervises and regulates the biggest banks in the country to make sure that they're operating safely. And so they have a big role to take on the Chases of the world and make sure that they're telling the truth and managing their finances appropriately. And then finally, you have the US Treasury with a really broad mission to maintain a strong economy, protect the integrity of the financial system. And they have a bunch of roles as well. Next slide. Into the opportunities before us. At the SEC, some of the key climate-related responsibilities that they have, they can require climate disclosure from public companies, banks, insurers. They can stop greenwashing so that companies can no longer brag to investors about their net zero plan if they're not giving details about what progress they're making. And they can provide, that's kind of the third point, ensure transparency around net zero transition plans. And we're trying to get them to include community impacts in that. There's an ongoing rulemaking process right now where the SEC is going to ask companies in the coming years to divulge a lot more information. So if you think of anything that your community would benefit from that you think could be tied to financial risk for companies, get your voice into the SEC and tell them that we need that information. They're including, at least the proposed rule includes greenhouse gas emissions, including financed emissions from banks, and details about transition plans. And we're pushing really hard to get inclusion of community consequences. So when projects harm communities and there's a potential for friction and pushback, that should be disclosed to investors so that they can reallocate capital towards companies that are not generating those types of harmful activities. And as I mentioned, a new report will come out soon, and we'll flag it for folks, and hopefully Kevin can share it around to your members about specific cases where these cases where there was non-respect for Indigenous rights or there's serious community conflicts have rebounded upon the company and and warrant further disclosure. Next slide. The Federal Reserve, they have some key climate-related responsibilities to monitor bank risk-taking and risk creation, like through financed emissions, to ensure community investment in mitigation and resilience comes through and protect communities from disinvestment along these along those stripes, and then to ensure mega banks are honoring their net zero transition plans. The Federal Reserve regulates and supervises the largest banks in the U.S., and like many of the ones April highlighted, they're contributing significantly to fossil fuel finance. Right now, the Fed is finalizing guidance so that their examiners, when they go in and do their yearly examination, they're going to be asked, how are you thinking about climate-related risk? Do you have a net zero transition plan? And is that transition plan just part of your marketing, or is it actually internalized within your strategy and risk management functions? We're hoping that supervision is a largely behind the scenes process, but we're hoping that this can generate some better behavior and the Fed can start scrutinizing those behaviors. Additionally, there's an opportunity for engagement that we'd love to ask you all to join us in. So there's a link to a petition. I don't know if I can add that to the chat. Oh, there it is. So Senator Markey and Representative Presley have a plan to curb Wall Street's climate finance, fossil fuel financing, called the Fossil Free Finance Act. And the bill would require large banks to write and execute plans enforceable by the Fed to align their financing of climate-related projects with emissions reductions required for a livable climate and a stable economy, because the Fed has to protect a stable economy and financial stability. Secondarily, if you or your members would like to sign, that's the petition. Additionally, in response to the recent bank failures of SVB, Signature, and First Republic, AFR has created a Substack with updates on the crisis, including the fallout and the response of policymakers. So if you're interested in staying up to date with how that crisis is unfolding, feel free to subscribe to our Substack. And then finally, I'll just put one other issue on your radar, the Community Reinvestment Act, which Kevin discussed in the opening, that we expect those rules, the new regulations, to be finalized soon. And we're hoping that they maintain the explicit climate investment provisions that would incentivize, encourage banks to proceed with mitigation and resilience financing for underserved communities. Next slide. I'll just, I think I'm out of time, so I'll just close out and say that there's other important roles for the Treasury Department, and they recently put out a great analysis of what financial stability, how to monitor for financial stability, and they included not just stability of banks and insurers, but also the stability and access to capital for low-income, minority, and underserved communities. That's the term that they used. And so this is a big opportunity for us to expand the scope of activities that the regulators monitor. So with that, I'll kick it back to Jamie.
Thank you, Alex, for that overview and all the resources. Next, to talk about some more federal level interventions, the Inflation Reduction Act specifically, is Sylvia Chi, who is a senior fellow and strategist on federal policies and financing for the Just Solutions Collective, where her role is to further policy innovation, foster peer learning, and help to build a greater policy capacity for BIPOC frontline groups. She's also an attorney and climate and environmental justice policy expert based in Oakland, previously served as policy director for Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and also currently leads policy advocacy and implementation for the California Public Banking Alliance, which we are big supporters of, and she earned her JD from University of Maryland School of Law and an AB from Dartmouth College. This is great information, thinking more on the solution side and local side for funding. So Sylvia, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. And yeah, really happy to be here with our friends from CRC, who have been great allies, especially in the public banking world. But today I'm going to be talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and what local communities can look forward to in terms of resources from it. So next slide. Hopefully you have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act. It was a big bill that was passed last year in August, and it was the biggest climate action that Congress has ever passed. There's a lot of different programs in it, and I'm only supposed to have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to try to go through a lot of them. I'm just going to focus on the two biggest ones, which are the tax credits and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Next slide. So this graph kind of shows you a quick overview of the full law and everything that's in it. And as you can see in the graph, the orange bar shows that the vast majority of the funds in this bill are in the form of tax expenditures, and specifically tax credits. And then all those little green bars show all of the other programs across all the, this is organized by the Senate committees that had jurisdiction, but all these different agencies have little pieces of it as well, but they're all dwarfed by the tax credits. Next slide. Yeah, so the estimates, the official estimates for the tax credits is that it'll cost $271 billion over the next decade. There's a lot of estimates from like outside sources that are putting that number much higher. I think the biggest number I've seen was $1.3 trillion. And that's because the way that these tax credits work is that they're uncapped, and they're generally, they're based on market mechanisms. So basically, if a corporation wants to get a tax credit, they just claim it in general. And the graph on the right shows that the tax credits span across a lot of different like types of energy, and it really reflects the all of the above approach that the Biden administration is taking, including some technologies that people in the environmental justice community consider false solutions, like carbon sequestration. But you'll also see here that there is a focus on power sector and electricity generation, and those are the light orange and dark orange segments at the top. The PTC and ITC are the production tax credit and investment tax credits, which have been around for a while and have now been extended. And then the clean electricity light orange part is like it's a new version of the PTC and ITC that is technology neutral, but will be based on life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And then the other graph here on the left shows that according to the official estimates, they're expecting that 86% of the tax credits will be taken up, their commercial tax credits, which will be mostly taken up by corporations, and then 14% will go to individuals. And it's also important to note that among the individual energy tax credits, a lot of these are extensions of existing tax credits that have been around for a while. And historically, we've seen that the vast majority of those tax credits benefit the highest income taxpayers. So there was a study that came out of UC Berkeley a few years ago that shows that 60% of the residential energy tax credits went to the top 20% of income. And then 89% of the EV tax credits for electric vehicles went to the top 20%. So it very much benefits the richest among us. And that makes sense if you think about it, because you need to have enough income tax liability to use the credits. And roughly 40% of Americans don't pay income tax, the vast majority of which is because they don't have enough income to owe taxes. Therefore, they can't use any of these credits because the credits only apply to what you owe. Sometimes people talk about this with a little bit of an inaccuracy. These are not refundable tax credits. However, there's an important change in this law that makes some of these tax credits now available to nonprofits and local or state governments through a new provision called direct pay. So these, like nonprofits, local governments, they're generally exempt from income taxes, but so they weren't previously able to use these tax credits, but now they will be able to use some of them. So that's a huge opportunity for transformation if those entities are able to take advantage of them to deploy clean energy resources. And then one last note on this slide is just that if you've heard of Justice 40, which is the Biden administration's initiative where they're promising that 40% of the benefits of clean energy and climate investments will flow to disadvantaged communities, meaning environmental justice communities. They have not named these tax credits as covered under Justice 40 yet. So that's something that we and many of our allies are still pushing them to do. Next slide. So this, there's one program within the tax credits that's really, really important and could be a huge opportunity, especially for low-income and disadvantaged communities, and that's the Low-Income Communities Bonus Credit Program. So this is a new program, and we're still waiting for a lot of the details because they're still developing guidance. But from what we know, there's a lot of potential. So this is part of the investment tax credit, and the way it works is it will make investments in small wind and solar projects at least 30% cheaper. Well, actually 30% is the base for investment tax credit. Well, 30% is generally what will apply under the investment tax credit. And then this program adds these bonuses for if they're sited in a low income community, you get an extra 10%. And then if it's part of a affordable housing building project, then you get an extra 20%. And if it's a low income economic benefit project, you get an extra 20%. And that low income economic benefit project basically means a community solar project or something similar. And this program is unlike the other tax credits. This one is capped. So there's only 1.8 gigawatts that are available on an annual basis. So project developers will have to apply, and then only certain winning applications will be able to get those bonuses, which raises questions about how accessible is this program actually going to be to the communities they're trying to benefit. And like I said, this is still in development. We haven't seen final guidance yet. So there's still a lot of outstanding questions about how Treasury will implement it, especially about ensuring that these projects truly benefit the local communities. So like a counter example is like if a big box like Walmart in a low income community gets subsidies to put solar panels on top of the store, that doesn't necessarily provide the same kinds of community benefits as providing community solar that reduces the energy burden of community members. So stay tuned on how that program works out, but I'm definitely encouraging folks who work in these communities to start thinking about what kinds of projects they might want to develop and apply for. Next slide. So the next program is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and this is the second biggest part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide. So overall, it's $27 billion in financial and technical assistance, and it has a pretty broad mandate in terms of what it's supposed to do, which is lower emissions of both greenhouse gases and other air pollutants, which is especially important for environmental justice communities who bear a lot of cumulative pollution burdens. So there's in the statute, they broke it up into two parts. One is the $7 billion zero emissions technology bucket, which EPA is now calling Solar for All. And then the $20 billion general and low income assistance program, that is the green finance program. And EPA had just announced last month, they released their implementation framework, and they're still in development of the implementation process. So this isn't final yet, but what they're saying that they're planning to do is that they want to break that $20 billion up into $14 billion for the National Clean Investment Fund for direct investment in projects, and then $6 billion for the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator for indirect investment. And then the timeline, Congress set a very ambitious timeline, wanting EPA to get all $27 billion out by September 30th, 2024. And we're all waiting for June, which is coming up very soon, when they will be releasing their notices of funding opportunities with more details on the program. And just to note that all these funds will go through intermediary entities. So the vast majority of us are not going to be applying directly to EPA. Will be, if you're applying for a project or for capitalization funding, you'll be applying to an intermediary. But overall, I think this is a huge opportunity to close the equity gaps and make sure that the renters and low income communities who can't benefit from the other IRA incentives like tax credits or rebates can realize some benefits. And in addition to the $27 billion, because this is designed to leverage private investment, there are estimates out there that, like McKinsey released an estimate that this program will be able to leverage an additional $200 billion invested in disadvantaged communities alone. And then if you add up to the general assistance for outside the low income and disadvantaged communities, they think it'll be more than $1 trillion in total private sector investment. Next slide. And this table just shows another way to kind of break down the program. There are some set-asides in the program for low-income and disadvantaged communities. So for the NCIF, the Direct Investment Program, they're setting aside $2 billion of the 14 for low-income and disadvantaged communities, and then the entire $6 billion for the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator is supposed to be for low-income and disadvantaged communities. Solar for All is also supposed to be, all of it is supposed to go to low-income and disadvantaged communities. And then you can see the different kinds of recipients that they haven't, that will be eligible for the different competitions. That complicated nonprofit definition they have basically means that there will be new entities, these new intermediary organizations will be created that will probably be coalitions of green banks or CDFIs and other community lenders who will be, they'll create these new nonprofit entities that will then turn around and redistribute the funds further. And the Solar for All is separate, not green financing so much as like directly to states, tribes, local governments to provide solar programs. Next slide. And then in case this helps clarify it in a visual, this is a flow chart that shows the structure of the program. And you can see there's 3 different buckets and how they interact with the community lenders, as well as the qualified projects that will ultimately be funded. And then the qualified, so at least, I think, at least some of the qualified projects, if not all of them, should be creating revenue that will be recycled to the community lenders so that there's a kind of sustainable aspect there. Next slide. So I know there's a lot of information on the slide. I won't go through all of it. But this just shows some more detail about the National Clean Investment Fund. That's the direct investment program. And then some of these are some of the terms and concepts that were in the implementation framework that EPA released last month. I highlighted in yellow the parts that I and other advocates are pushing back on, and we're hoping that they will change. So they were saying that the eligible financial assistance will not include grants, and so we're saying they should. Okay, so now we're on the CCIA slide. Similarly, this is the indirect investment ones, which is for capitalizing community lenders. And community lenders means both green banks, credit unions, CDFIs, and other nonprofit lenders. So for both the and for the capitalization funding, EPA was saying that there should be a maximum of $5 million per community lender. We think it should be more flexible and perhaps bigger. Same thing for the technical assistance subawards. We don't like their maximum that they've proposed. And for both of these programs, a lot of these requirements, again, will apply just to those intermediaries, and the intermediaries are going to be responsible for making sure that like the qualified projects meet the requirements that EPA set out. So there's a potential for things to kind of fall between the gaps there if EPA isn't providing really close oversight of those intermediaries. And part of the reason the program was designed this way is that EPA wants to get the money out to these intermediaries as fast as possible, in part because this program is under a lot of attack from Republicans, and so they want to be able to get it out to a place where Republicans in Congress can't attack it. Next slide. So because so much of the power and decision making in this program is going to be within these intermediaries, we and a lot of other organizations are concerned that there's the possibility that the benefits for equity and the low income and disadvantaged communities aren't going to be realized. So my organization and several others have come together to create this best practices for governance and equity pledge, which we've gotten support from over 50 organizations endorsing it. And what we're doing is we're calling on the applicants for those green finance programs to publicly commit to robust governance structures and processes that center equity and environmental justice and provide meaningful accountability to local communities and the public. And then we're going to be engaging with the applicants. We're also engaging with EPA and trying to see how much of these best practices they can incorporate as part of the implementation process as well. Next slide. And this is just an overview of the best practices. We go into more detail in the actual document, and I can also share in the chat box the links here. But generally, we want to make sure that the intermediaries prioritize providing direct benefits to low income and disadvantaged communities, that they do community engagement with the local communities where these projects will be, that they're accountable to the communities, including having representation at their governing board and leadership levels, operate with transparency, and then also provide safeguards so that this program doesn't cause harm to communities. And I think that is it for me. And so I will hand it back to Jamie.
Thank you, Sylvia, for that overview of a very complicated and robust bill and condensing that information. Yeah, you had some resources that also summarize the information which we've shared in the chat. And just reiterating that we will send these slides out next. And finally, we're going to get down to the local level with Wendy Miranda, who is a policy associate at Esperanza Community Housing Corporation, where she supports policy work at Esperanza through advocacy and outreach in multiple coalition spaces, which they will talk about, such as affordable housing, environmental justice, equitable development, and more. So again, related to some of those IRA Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund programs. Prior to joining Esperanza, Wendy has worked on environmental justice, tenants' rights, and transit justice in the Harbor and South LA area, which, as we mentioned at the beginning, are disproportionately affected by these climate chaos and the outsized amount of oil and gas drilling sites, which I believe they will talk about. So I will hand it over to you, Wendy.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Jamie, and thank you, CRC, for the invitation, and also to everyone listening to us. Thank you for being here. Yeah, my name is Wendy Miranda. I'm a policy associate with Esperanza Community Housing. We are a nonprofit based here in South Central LA. And we bring the perspective as both an affordable housing provider as well as an environmental justice organization. And we see housing as both a basic health and human right, and also look at things through the intersection of housing justice and environmental justice. And today I'll just be highlighting just two local efforts here going on in LA, climate equity and resilience in our coalition spaces. Next slide, please. So the first one that I'm going to be talking about is our work through the Stand LA Coalition. Stand LA is actually an acronym. It stands for Standing Together Against Neighborhood Drilling. And we are an environmental justice coalition of community groups that seek to end neighborhood oil drilling to protect the health and safety of Angelenos on the front lines of urban oil extraction. And we work with our partner organizations, which include Resiliency for Social Responsibility here in LA, Communities for a Better Environment, Home and United Methodist Church, Redeemer Community Partnership, Strategic Concepts in Organizing and Policy Education, Black Women for Wellness, and Liberty Hill Foundation. And the Stand LA Coalition formed in 2014, and it really grew out of frontline communities being tired of neighborhood drilling occurring right next to their homes, their schools, their parks, etc. A lot of folks may not know this, but LA is home to the largest urban oil field in the country. There are over 1,000 active oil wells throughout the city, many of which are located in low-income communities of color, again, right next to their homes, as you can see in the picture on the right. And research has shown that living in close proximity to oil drilling can result in several negative health impacts, such as asthma and other respiratory illnesses, miscarriage, birth defects, and more. And frontline communities really just came together and said, enough is enough. We don't want drilling where we're living. And after more than a decade of work, the city passed an ordinance last year that declared oil and gas extraction as a non-conforming land use. And so now where we are with this campaign, we are hoping to shape the next part of this, which is cleaning/remediating these sites as a step towards healing the land and communities and ensuring that any future land use is healthy, community envisioned, and community serving land use. Next slide, please. And the other coalition that I wanted to talk about or highlight right here is the LEAP LA Coalition. LEAP LA is a coalition, a climate justice coalition that aims to create spaces to practice healing, remediation, and community resilience. We work with partner organizations, which include Physicians for Social Responsibility, Communities for a Better Environment, Strategic Beautiful and Sacred Places Institute, Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, Climate Solutions, and Have a Healthy, Thriving, Resilient LA. And in collaboration with CMO, we aim to create policies to decarbonize buildings, which is the reduction of carbon emissions, while ensuring that these new solutions center racial justice and equity, and that our communities are not inadvertently harmed or overburdened by this policy. In LA, in fact, buildings are the largest single source of carbon emissions. They emit 43% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions. And decarbonization would help reduce these carbon emissions, improve indoor and outdoor air quality, reduce reliance on fossil fuels, and meet the city's climate goals. And after a series of workshops in collaboration with CMO, which centered frontline community members, policy recommendations were drafted, and eventually the city passed an ordinance to decarbonize new buildings last year. And now we are in the process of creating policy recommendations for existing buildings, some of which include conducting an affordable housing gap assessment to really determine what it is that's needed to meet these decarbonization goals. And also another example being to amend the city's tenant anti-harassment ordinance to really protect tenants from decarbonization related harassment, just to name a few examples. Next slide, please. And really just to summarize on the next steps for each of the coalition spaces that I highlighted here with Stand LA and the oil and gas work, the next step would be to work on the cleanup ordinance that ensures proper plugging of wells and comprehensive site remediation. And with LEAP LA, our climate justice work, is to work on the decarbonization of existing buildings, but making sure that that is equitable, that it protects tenants and workers and really preserves affordable housing. And some of the gaps that we found in our work really have been, one, being addressing the intersectional issues, right? Our communities have been talking about the climate crisis for decades, and they are often the most burdened. And oftentimes when we talk about the climate crisis or when we talk about the lack of affordable housing crisis, sometimes they're seen as separate crises, but our communities are really experiencing the intersection of it. So when we start viewing this through that lens, we can really start creating more comprehensive policies or solutions, which leads me to my next gap, is really making sure that we have those comprehensive policies to heal and repair. Policies that are comprehensive of addressing the root causes and undo the harm of past racist policies like redlining, for example. And this is the only way that we can move away from having sacrifice zones for the benefit of the few, as well as the false choice from choosing between our health and our jobs or our health and our homes, that those that are in power keep trying to force on us in order to deflect from the extractive policies from which they benefit. And there is also a need for a true just transition and recovery, where we not only have proper cleanup and remediation of former oil sites, but also ensure that communities who have been farmed are at the forefront, that they are centered in policies, and that there is community visioning and participation for healthy community serving land use. And lastly, wanting to point out funding, right? When we think about how to really center frontline communities in this climate crisis, we need to think about how we invest in these communities and undo harm. We need to hold all actors accountable, which also includes the banks, right? They have benefited from regulatory systems that have condoned racist zoning policies with like redlining and other discriminatory financing policies, while simultaneously also financing the placement of toxic industrial land uses in the middle of our neighborhoods. And when we think about the intersection of like the lack of affordable housing crisis and the climate crisis, we need to not just focus on production, but also the preservation of affordable housing and tenant protections and reducing utility costs so that our communities are not displaced or have that financial burden. Current cost of building affordable housing is so high. We all know this, and it's really because like our financing structures are not really set up with equity in mind. Instead, we are told that the barrier to building housing are things like CEQA, for example. But exempting this would really deflect health and those environmental safeguards that our communities really need. And I know that's going to take a really long time to get to. We're definitely working on it. But in the meanwhile, what we can do is really, we can include in like community benefits agreements to require banks to put money towards production and preservation of affordable housing in communities that are most at risk of gentrification and displacement, and also towards remediation of toxic sites and overall disinvesting in the fossil fuel industry. This will really help us move as a closer step to undoing past harms, heal our communities, and really reverse the legacy of housing discrimination and environmental racism. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jamie.
Thank you so much, Wendy. It's really interesting to hear what's happening on the ground and within the communities that are most impacted by this. I think most of the questions have been answered. I think one question that came to mind for me, that especially for Wendy, but maybe for everyone, what is a proper advocacy balance? What really worked in LA to decarbonize? And from maybe other panelists' perspectives, what is necessary with balancing an inside strategy of dialogues and meetings with either banks or the companies behind the drilling sites or LA City Council, and then what's the proper balance between that and street protests or grassroots organizing, if anyone has a response to that. And then there was also a question about scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosures that I think Alex answered, but also in case maybe April wanted to answer that as well.
Oh, I could start off then with the first question that you asked, Jamie, about like at least what's proper advocacy balance between like the inside strategy and outside strategy. I think it really depends on the campaign and like the coalition, right? Like in multiple spaces, like in multiple coalition spaces that we're in, sometimes we're more focused on an inside strategy. But in the Stand LA coalition, for example, there have been times where we've focused more on an outside strategy. And sometimes, you know, outside strategy is really a way to like kind of just kick things off, to gain more attraction or to get more attention, really, so that policymakers can really see like, hey, you know what, this is an issue, you know, this is what our communities are facing, that they need to really just like, again, pay attention to us. So I would say it really depends on the campaign, but sometimes the outside strategy can help with at least starting off and gaining that attention.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone else had any other perspectives or any additional advocacy opportunities to plug.
Well, Jamie, can I ask a question? So first of all, thank you. Excellent presentations, terrific. And Wendy, that photo you started out with the drilling happening like right over the homes was amazing. And you kind of ended, I think your last line was funding. So you talked about this, but I wanted to get the perspective from folks on the panel. We're CRC, we're trying to get financial institutions, other corporations to stop doing things that are harmful, but we're also trying to get them to invest in things that are helpful. And I just wanted to hear more, if there's more, maybe to start with Wendy and then maybe Sylvia, in thinking about the IRA, where there's opportunity either through community benefits agreements with banks and the Community Reinvestment Act, or through the IRA or otherwise, to say like, well, there's going to be money for good things, but what are the best of the good things? What should we be really focused on? And I appreciate, Wendy, you saying like affordable housing and remediation, which is important to hear. So I don't know if Wendy, there's more that you would add to that list, and then Sylvia and others, if there are things that you would say like these are the kinds of things we should be really pushing for.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for that question. I would say there's really a long list, but I would say honestly, just like these oil sites are really like the low-hanging fruit, right? I would say this is the first step. I actually saw an article the other day that said that that California would actually need like $21 billion to clean up of California's oil sites, right? But again, oil sites are that low-hanging fruit. So I would say is the most feasible, right? So I think that's one way that we can really allocate these funding sources. But also, I would also add that like really just working with community-based organizations that are already doing the work, that are really on the ground, starting from the ground, and specifically prioritizing funding dispersal in these disadvantaged communities or EJ communities. Really, I know with like the Leap LA Coalition, for example. I know we recently sent out a letter to the city listing out our climate priorities, and one of them have been that asking the city that they should require like a minimum of like 40% of the federal climate and infrastructure funds to be allocated directly to disadvantaged communities, and really establish like a Justice 40 oversight committee to tackle this. So that's like one way to, or something else to that.
Yeah, and I would definitely +1 everything Wendy just said. One thing that we've been doing is a lot of these comment letters to agencies about how they should implement all these different programs in IRA. And I find myself writing the same thing in every letter about how they need to make sure that technical assistance gets to community-based organizations, because we want them to be able to, the community organizations to be able to really participate in the development of these programs and how they're implemented, and be able to identify what are the benefits that the community really needs. And I think some of these programs and agencies are doing better at that than others, but it really can't be emphasized enough that that's a huge need. Especially like for the tax credits, there's, as far as I know, there's no technical assistance that IRS is giving out to organizations to actually take advantage of them. And that's extremely needed, because organizations and even local governments have no, most of them, the vast majority of them have no experience and expertise working with tax credits. And that is the biggest part of IRA. And then another point just about remediation is that one thing that was really good news that hasn't gotten a lot of attention in both IRA and the infrastructure law is reauthorization of Superfund, which like I started working in environmental policy a while ago, and like it's been a long fight to try to get that reauthorized. And it's important because that is how the federal government operationalizes the polluter pays principle, which is really foundational to environmental justice, and really is not a big enough part of our whole environmental regulatory scheme in the United States.
Go ahead, Alex.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to give one thought, kind of responsive to the previous question, but also to this, about CBAs and getting the affordable housing and remediation constraints. I think we have an opportunity right now where we can leverage movements at the regulators when you're negotiating with banks about getting those good investment in as part of CBAs. You can pitch it as a way to comply with the new federal banking regulations coming online, the CRA, and the new climate supervision. I think banks right now don't quite understand, and well, I won't speak for them necessarily, but it's unclear exactly how they're going to comply with some of these new regulations. But that's a great opportunity to come in and say, maybe a CBA that looks like this will help you manage your own supervisory process with your regulator. So a little bit of a side point, but I think you have a lot of leverage right now if you couch these solutions as ways for them to deal with their regulatory burden.
Great. Well, we're at the last minute here, a little bit over. I wonder if there were any additional resources or anything to put in the chat. I'm just going to again link our climate cohort interest form for attendees to join. And yeah, I don't know if any other panelists, again, just to reiterate, we will send out this slide deck, which has all the info and I believe contact information for the panelists. Our PPP report is going to come out in June, and I can also, in the follow-up with the deck, send over the panelists action items and links and resources contained in it. I don't know if anyone had any final thoughts, otherwise we can wrap up.